Hi and welcome back to a new video. I'm pretty sure you followed the recent news that happened in the past weeks with memory prices drastically increasing, currently being about 4 times more expensive than a year ago. Then also SSDs becoming more expensive and eventually also GPUs. And while you might think, okay, it makes sense because there is memory on the GPUs, I can tell you it is not only memory related and it will become much worse shortly. Thermal Grizzly Duronaut is our new high-end thermal paste and the successor of Cryonaut. It's even better performing, it is much easier to apply, it is cheaper, and it's much more durable. That's where the name comes from. Especially if you're now maybe considering to buy a new PC, then I would highly recommend that you're looking into this thermal paste. So let's continue with this video. I want to give you a quick summary of things that recently happened. So we had Hardware Unboxed getting a statement from ASUS during CES that the RTX 5070 Ti is apparently end of life. Then things were going back and forth between the two, with ASUS ending up issuing a statement publicly stating that the RTX 5070 Ti is not end of life and is meant to be still sold. And at roughly the same time, there was also the news, the leak, that Nvidia is cutting supply of RTX consumer GPUs by about 20%. And to make sure we're all on the same page, understanding everything correctly, I just want to give you a bit more information from the start. So we're talking about AIBs, and AIBs are the add-in board partners. So those could be ASUS, Gigabyte, MSI, the ones that you usually know as the vendor of the graphics card, even though they just basically assemble it, because they buy the GPU from Nvidia, as you know, but usually they do not only buy the GPU, but also at the same time in a bundle also the memory. For example, on this RTX 5070 Ti, that would be a total of 60 GB, so we have 8 memory ICs with 2 GB each of GDDR7. And Nvidia is supplying the entire thing. So they are supplying a bundle of a GPU and the 8 memory ICs. Of course, it's going to be a larger scale, so they will not buy a single GPU and 8 memory ICs, they will buy hundreds and thousands of those sets to then build those graphics cards. Depending on the market situation, this was either a good or a bad topic in the past. It also depends on who you ask in which exact situation. So it could be depending on if it's a big AIB, small AIB, and if the demand was currently big or small. So that definitely changed over the years. I heard a lot of different stories about this topic. But in general, it means that a big AIB like MSI, Gigabyte, ASUS, they could probably approach a big memory vendor themselves, like Micron or Hynix, and ask them for a certain set of memory. They could probably source it themselves. Whereas if it's a very small AIB, they might find it difficult to get the allocation for a big amount of memory chips. And that's why it sometimes can be good that Nvidia is providing it exactly in a bundle to make sure that if they're selling a GPU, it can actually be turned into a GPU. But it also means that they are tied to whatever is Nvidia charging, right? And right now, because Nvidia is basically a fabless manufacturer, they don't manufacture GPUs, they don't manufacture memory, they just hand over the contract to, for example, TSMC, then they get their GPUs, and then they buy the memory from like Hynix, Samsung, or Micron, for example. And then they are selling it to their partners. And now when memory prices increase, they will also charge more from the AIBs. And when there is everything sold as a bundle, it also means that the AIBs have no chance of trying to source the memory themselves, maybe for a cheaper option. And at the same time, it also means that just by the memory prices increasing, Nvidia is increasing their revenue. And now we're getting over to the topic why I'm even making this video, and that is because I received some kind of classified and super interesting information of what Nvidia is doing behind the scenes with their partners. And that is all about MSRP. And if you just go back 10-15 years and look at GPUs and the MSRP, usually you had the launch and Nvidia was recommending an MSRP. And at that time, during launch, like the first few days, it was often at about MSRP, and then it usually quickly dropped because you had the AIBs like MSI, Gigabyte, ASUS. They were all competition, and the competition worked the way it is intended, that the prices were going down just because of supply and demand. But if you think back, just from the RTX 30 launch, this didn't really happen anymore. The MSRP was communicated, but most of the time it was not really possible to sell those cards below the MSRP. At least it did not happen for whatever reason. Now with the RTX 50 launch, and I think I also mentioned this in one of my launch videos, there was this thing that Nvidia differed between having an MSRP card and a non-MSRP card. MSRP cards were always allowed to be published, the reviews, one day ahead. So if as a reviewer you received an MSRP card, you could just show your review on launch day. And then if you had a card that was clocked 25 megahertz higher and cost $50 more, you had to wait another day. That already made no sense. I already talked about that during the review phase a couple of months ago. And because it just doesn't make a difference in some of the cases, but Nvidia put a high focus on pushing these MSRP cards. And obviously most of the reviewers were also trying to get MSRP cards, not because they like them so much, but because from a reviewer perspective, it doesn't make sense to review the exact same card. They might differ from the cooler design, they're a bit more expensive, but you will have the same GPU and you will have the same memory on it. So it's going to be the same performance, and you would not, as a reviewer, want to publish your video one day later just because it's $30 more expensive on paper. And for the last couple of years, this MSRP topic was really difficult, especially for us reviewers. It was difficult to just give a comment on this because you never knew if this is going to happen or not. You know, you had three aspects basically. You had Nvidia giving you the MSRP, what they think it's going to cost. Then you had you people out there, what you were thinking you would like to pay for this. And then there was the reality. And the reality is something completely different. That is usually a result of supply and demand. Then you have the trader in between, the big shops. They also add their margin on it, and then it could be something completely different. And influencing this price, the MSRP or the price where it's actually being sold for, is quite difficult. But Nvidia thought, hey, we're Nvidia, we can do that. And that's why they had the so-called OPP program. Don't ask me what OPP stands for. I tried to find it out, but I didn't get a reply, or I didn't find out more information about what it stands for. But at least I was able to verify this information through two different sources to make sure that this is actually legit. And apparently the OPP program existed until a couple of days ago. The OPP program is basically like a cashback thing, where Nvidia tried to actively influence the AIBs and the pricing to make sure that some cards happen on the market and that they are actually being sold by the AIBs for the MSRP. And as far as I know, all the big AIBs were actually part of this. And now if you were one of the big AIBs and you decided that you would want, for example, to sell this RTX 5070 Ti at MSRP, it was simply impossible without Nvidia's help. Because the AIB, you know, they make a nice cooler design, they make their PCB, backplate, and all the kind of things that assemble a graphics card, except for the memory, which they had to buy from Nvidia. And if you would just look at the raw cost of the card after it's being produced, it seemed to be impossible to sell this card at MSRP without Nvidia's help. This means in result that the partners had to be buddies with Nvidia, they had to team up and then guarantee that they would sell the cards at MSRP through the shops and then report back to Nvidia with numbers, with pricing, to then get like a cashback, which was the only way how they could sell these cards at MSRP. Otherwise, it was just simply too expensive. And while this entire thing might sound like some price fixing agreement, which might be illegal, honestly, I'm not a lawyer and I have no clue if this is legal or not. But in the past, I would also say it wouldn't really matter too much because in the first moment, Nvidia was probably selling the GPUs and memory too expensive to the partners, so they could not realize the MSRP in practice. And then Nvidia used the OPP program to kind of force this MSRP into the market to make sure that the consumer could actually buy cards at the MSRP. Now the thing is, out of nowhere, it seems like Nvidia completely cancelled the OPP program, so it no longer exists. And in result, you will have to expect massive price increases across all of these cards. So that means that MSRP that Nvidia communicated in the past basically no longer exists. It's completely irrelevant. I double-checked this information with two sources I know in the industry, and both confirmed that this existed. And they also confirmed that the rumors about 5070 Ti are true, that Nvidia heavily cut the supply for this card and there will be almost no supply for this card anymore, and they are shifting the supply towards the RTX 5080. But you will have to expect massive price increases for both of them. Usually I'm not making these kind of videos because it's not really my style, but just receiving this information, double checking it, it seems to be worth it, especially giving you the information early. and that this might be the last time, the last days to secure a 5080 at a somewhat reasonable price, because it's expected that they will see a massive price increase, like a triple price increase, not in terms of percentage or something, but caused by 3 reasons. So first of all, it seems like the information that Hardware Box received from ASUS was kind of true. It was not fully wrong, because it seems like it's not EOL, but Nvidia seems to be cutting the supply for these GB203 GPUs completely for the 5070 Ti and wants to move it towards the 5080, because it kind of makes sense if you have a very high yield rate on the GB203 GPU, because it's the same, both cards share the same GPU, but with a high yield rate you might want to use those GPUs with full extent on the RTX 5080 instead, because you would earn more money on it. Then canceling the OPP program will bring up the prices anyway, and then Nvidia also increases the prices because of the full memory crisis. This means that at least the industry partners I talked to, they are expecting a price increase of about 40 to 50% overall on the 5080. So moving from like half a year ago, roughly 1,000 euros to 1,400 to 1,500 euros, which is quite a solid price increase. Now, the thing I didn't figure out yet is, why did the OPP program exist in the first place? If you're looking at Nvidia, the only thing they care about is how can they make more money to increase the stock price further, right? That's the only thing that they seem to care about. They certainly do not care about the consumer, otherwise they would not act the way. And you would maybe also not have 12-volt high power anymore. Anyway, but it all just doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, if they would care about the consumer pricing, they would not do these moves. They would not cancel the OPP program. They would not move the GPU supply from 5070 Ti to 5080 to artificially increase the pricing of this to earn more. All of this is quite odd. So I have literally no clue why the OPP program existed in the first place. Like, why did they even care to push some cards for MSRP? If you have an idea why this existed, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. It also seems to be true that RTX 50 Super Series might not make it to the market at all. At least it sounds plausible with the current situation of very bad memory supply. The Super Series was meant to only have a bit more memory on the card, which is in this situation quite difficult, I would say, and Nvidia is probably selling them anyway. They're selling them at a higher margin with artificially cutting supply and all of this. Yeah. You know, if you ask me, it's just kind of sad how Nvidia evolved into something. It's just not nice. And even if the AI hype, if it goes down in a couple of years maybe, and Nvidia feels the need to go back to the consumer market, I will probably not forget about that topic. And I honestly hope that AMD and Intel will take this opportunity and not do stupid mistakes like also increase pricing artificially. But this is definitely the chance for them to catch up a little bit on the market, gain market share if they take the right choice and get good pricing. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time. Bye bye.